What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks onto a morning show stage expecting a normal interview, only to be blindsided by a host who seems more interested in tearing him down than having a real conversation? In just 36 seconds of tension-filled back and forth, George Stephanopoulos went from smug morning show host to the man who pushed Samuel L. Jackson too far, ending in an exit that nobody in that studio will ever forget. Samuel L. Jackson walked onto the Good Morning America set that morning with the kind of calm confidence he always carries. He had been on this show before. He knew how these things worked. Smile for the camera, talk about the new movie, share a funny story or two, shake some hands, and head out. Simple, easy, professional. But from the very first moment he sat down in that chair across from George Stephanopoulos, something felt different. The energy was off. George had this look on his face, this little smirk, like he knew something Samuel didn't, like he had been waiting for this moment. The camera started rolling and George opened with what seemed like a normal greeting. "Samuel, thanks for being here. Great to have you back on the show." Samuel nodded, friendly as always. "Good to be here, man. Always a pleasure." But then George's tone shifted. It was subtle at first, but it was there. "So, Samuel, I've got to ask. You've been in Hollywood for a very long time now. Do you ever worry that maybe your time has passed? That maybe audiences are looking for something different these days?" The studio went quiet. You could feel the crew behind the camera stiffen up. That was not a normal question. That was not how you talk to a guest, especially not someone like Samuel L. Jackson. But Samuel kept his cool. He gave a small laugh, the kind that says he's giving George a chance to walk that back. "My time has passed? Man, I just had one of the biggest movies of the year. I think I'm doing all right." George leaned back in his chair, and that smirk got a little wider. Sure, but let's be honest. You play the same character in every movie, don't you? The tough guy with the attitude, the guy who yells a lot. Don't you think people are getting tired of that?" Samuel's smile faded just a little. He was still keeping it together, still trying to be professional, but you could see something change in his eyes. "I think people like what I bring to the screen. I think that's why directors keep calling me. That's why audiences show up." George laughed, actually laughed, like Samuel had just told a joke. "Audiences show up for the special effects and the explosions, Samuel. Let's not pretend they're buying tickets just to see you." And there it was. The line had been crossed. The studio felt like all the air had been sucked out of it. Samuel sat forward in his chair, looking George dead in the eyes. His voice was still calm, but there was steel in it now. "What exactly are you trying to say here, George?" George didn't back down. If anything, he leaned into it harder. "I'm saying that maybe you've built a career on playing it safe, on doing the same thing over and over because it's easy, because you know it works. But is that really acting? Or is that just showing up and collecting a paycheck?" Samuel stared at him for a long moment, the kind of stare that makes people uncomfortable, the kind of stare that says you just made a big mistake. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but sharp. "You think I'm just showing up and collecting a paycheck?" George shrugged, like he was just making conversation. "I'm asking the question a lot of people are thinking. You've done, 100 movies? More? And how many of those performances were truly memorable? How many of those roles actually challenged you?" Samuel shook his head slowly. "Man, you don't know what you're talking about." But George kept going. He was on a roll now, and he clearly thought he was winning this exchange. "I've been watching your career for years, Samuel, and I've got to say, I'm just not that impressed. You're fine, you're good at what you do, but great? I don't know about that." The crew was shifting uncomfortably now. A producer off to the side was making frantic hand signals at George, trying to get him to change the subject, but George ignored them. He was locked in on Samuel, enjoying this too much to stop. Samuel's jaw tightened. "You want to talk about great? You want to talk about what I've done? How about we talk about you, George? How about we talk about how you sit in this chair every morning, asking softball questions to celebrities, pretending like you're some kind of serious journalist? You think that's impressive?" George's face went red. "Excuse me? You heard me. You're sitting here trying to tear me down because what? Because it makes you feel important? Because you think it makes good television? Man, you're embarrassing yourself." George tried to laugh it off, but it came out forced and fake. "Samuel, I think you're taking this a little too personally. I'm just asking questions." "Nah, man, you're not asking questions. You're being disrespectful. There's a difference." George's voice got sharper now, more defensive. "Disrespectful? I'm doing my job. I'm pushing back. That's what good interviewers do." Samuel stood up from his chair. Not fast, not aggressive, but with purpose. The kind of movement that makes everyone in the room pay attention. Good interviewers show respect to their guests. They have actual conversations. They don't sit there trying to score points by putting people down. George stood up too, trying to match Samuel's energy. Maybe if you could handle a little criticism, we could have an actual conversation. Criticism? Samuel's voice got louder now. Man, you haven't said one intelligent thing this entire time. You're just talking to hear yourself talk. You're trying to make yourself look good by making me look bad, and it's not working. George pointed his finger at Samuel. Actually, pointed his finger, like he was scolding a child. You know what? Maybe the problem is that you can't handle it when someone tells you the truth. Maybe you're so used to everyone kissing up to you that you forgot what real accountability looks like. Samuel laughed. Not a friendly laugh. A laugh that said this conversation was over. Real accountability? From you? Man, get out of here with that. George's face was fully red now. He was angry, but he was also embarrassed because he knew he was losing this exchange. I don't have to stand here and take this from you. You don't have to stand here at all, George. This is your show. But I'll tell you what, I'm not standing here either. I'm done with this. Samuel pulled off his microphone and set it on the chair. The sound of it hitting the leather echoed through the studio. George tried to recover, tried to take back control of the situation. So that's it? You're just going to walk off? Very professional, Samuel. Samuel turned back to look at him one more time. You want to talk about professional? A professional host doesn't ambush their guests. A professional host doesn't sit there trying to embarrass people for no reason. You're not a journalist, George. You're just a guy with a TV show who got a little too comfortable, George sputtered, trying to come up with a comeback. I was just asking legitimate questions about your career. No, you were being a jerk, and I don't have time for that. I've got better things to do than sit here and let you take shots at me because you're feeling insecure about whatever's going on in your own life. The producer was on the set now, trying to calm things down, trying to get Samuel to stay, but Samuel was already walking toward the exit. George called after him, his voice getting desperate. You can't just leave in the middle of an interview. We're live. Samuel stopped at the edge of the set and looked back one last time. Watch me. And then he was gone. Just like that. The crew stood there in stunned silence. George stood at his desk, mouth open, not sure what to do next. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of his humiliation. One of the other hosts tried to jump in and save the segment, smiling at the camera with the kind of forced cheerfulness that only made things more awkward. Well, we'll take a quick break and be right back. But the damage was done. Everyone in that studio knew they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for a long time. George had pushed too far, said too much, and Samuel L. Jackson had done what needed to be done. He walked away with his dignity intact, leaving George to deal with the mess he had created. In the green room backstage, Samuel sat down and let out a long breath. One of the assistants came over, nervous, asking if he needed anything. Samuel shook his head. I'm good, just get me out of here. Meanwhile, back on set, George was trying to regroup during the commercial break. His producers were swarming him, some looking angry, some looking worried. One of them asked him what he was thinking, why he went after Samuel like that. George tried to defend himself. I was just doing my job. I was asking tough questions. But even he knew that wasn't true. He had let his ego take over. He had wanted to prove something, to show that he could go toe-to-toe with a major star, and instead, he had just made himself look small. When the show came back from commercial, George tried to play it off. He made some comment about how things got heated, how sometimes interviews take unexpected turns, but you could see it in his face. He knew he had messed up. He knew that clip was going to be everywhere by the end of the day, and he was right. By that afternoon, the video was all over the internet. People were sharing it, commenting on it, taking sides, and almost everyone was on Samuel's side. They saw what happened. They saw a host who got too comfortable, too cocky, and tried to tear down a guest for no good reason. They saw Samuel L. Jackson stand up for himself, refuse to be disrespected, and walk away on his own terms. The thing is, Samuel didn't do anything wrong. He came to that show ready to be a good guest, ready to promote his movie, ready to have a nice conversation. But George had other plans. George wanted to make a moment, wanted to create some drama, wanted to show everyone how tough and fearless he could be. And it backfired spectacularly, because at the end of the day, there's a difference between asking tough questions and just being rude. There's a difference between challenging a guest and trying to embarrass them. And George crossed that line. He crossed it early, and he kept going, thinking he was in control, thinking he was making great television. But Samuel saw right through it. He gave George multiple chances to pull back, to change direction, to turn the interview into something resembling a real conversation. And when George refused, when he just kept pushing and pushing, Samuel made a choice. He chose his own self-respect over sitting there and taking abuse from a morning show host who thought he was more important than he actually was. That's what made the moment so powerful. It wasn't about a celebrity having a meltdown or losing their temper. It was about a man who knew his worth, who understood that he didn't have to sit there and be treated like that, and who had the courage to stand up and walk away. George tried to spin it afterward. He tried to make it seem like Samuel was being difficult, like he couldn't handle criticism, like the whole thing was somehow Samuel's fault. But nobody was buying it. The video spoke for itself. You could watch it and see exactly what happened. You could see George pushing buttons, trying to get a reaction, trying to make himself look smart at Samuel's expense. And you could see Samuel handling it with more grace than George deserved, right up until the moment he decided enough was enough. The interview started with what should have been a simple question. George could have asked about the new movie, about Samuel's process, about anything that would have led to an interesting conversation. Instead, he went straight for the insult, questioning Samuel's relevance, his talent, his entire career. And he did it with this attitude, this smugness, like he thought he was entitled to say whatever he wanted just because he was the host. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was not backing down when Samuel gave him the chance. When Samuel pushed back, when he made it clear that the disrespect wasn't going to fly, George should have apologized. He should have said something like, "You're right, that came out wrong, let's start over." But he didn't. His ego wouldn't let him. Instead, he doubled down, insisted he was just doing his job, and kept attacking. By the time Samuel stood up, it was over. George had lost the room, lost the audience, lost whatever credibility he thought he had. Samuel walking off wasn't a tantrum, it was a statement. It was him saying, "I don't have to put up with this, and neither does anyone else." The crew knew it too. You could see it in their faces during the whole exchange. They knew George was out of line. They knew this was going to be a problem. And when Samuel walked off, there was probably a part of them that was relieved. Someone finally said what needed to be said. Someone finally called George out for the way he was acting. And that's the thing about moments like this. They matter because they show people that it's okay to stand up for yourself. It's okay to say no. It's okay to walk away from situations where you're not being treated with basic respect. Samuel L. Jackson didn't storm off crying or throwing things. He didn't yell or threaten anyone. He simply removed himself from a toxic situation with his head held high. George, on the other hand, was left standing there looking foolish. He had tried to dominate the conversation, tried to establish himself as the one in control, and instead, he just exposed himself as someone who doesn't understand the basic principles of respect and professionalism. He thought he was being brave. He thought he was being bold. But really, he was just being a bully. And bullies always think they're winning right up until the moment they realize everyone is looking at them with disgust instead of admiration. The questions George asked weren't even that clever. They were lazy provocations dressed up as insight, asking if Samuel's time has passed, saying he plays the same character in every movie. These are things internet trolls say, not things a professional journalist should lead with. And the way he said them, with that little smirk, with that tone, it was clear he wasn't interested in Samuel's actual answer. He just wanted to land a punch. Samuel could have matched that energy. He could have come back at George with personal attacks, could have made fun of his career, could have really torn into him. But he didn't. He stayed focused. He called out the behavior without getting down in the mud. That takes discipline. That takes maturity. And it made George look even worse by comparison. When George said audiences show up for special effects and not for Samuel, that was the moment he revealed what this was really about. It wasn't about asking tough questions. It was about trying to diminish Samuel, trying to make him feel small. And why? What did George have to gain from that? Did he think it would make him look smarter? Did he think it would make him seem fearless? All it did was make him look insecure. Because secure people don't need to tear others down. Secure people can ask challenging questions without being insulting. They can have difficult conversations without making it personal. George couldn't do that. He went straight for the personal attacks and then acted surprised when Samuel didn't want to sit there and take it. The moment when Samuel called George out for not being a real journalist, that hit hard. Because it was true. George sits in that chair every morning, yes. But what does he actually do? He reads from a teleprompter. He asks pre-written questions. He smiles for the camera. That's not journalism. That's hosting. And there's nothing wrong with being a host, but don't pretend you're something you're not. Don't act like you're some hard-hitting investigative reporter when you're really just there to keep people entertained for a few minutes before they head to work. Samuel saw through that. He saw George trying to play a role, trying to be someone he wasn't, and he called him on it. And George's reaction said everything. He got defensive, he got angry, he pointed fingers, all the things people do when they know they've been caught. The finger pointing was especially telling. That's what you do when you've lost an argument and you're trying to regain some kind of authority. You point, you gesture, you try to physically dominate the space because you can't dominate the conversation. Samuel didn't need to do any of that. He just stood there, calm and sure, and let George make himself look ridiculous. When Samuel said George was trying to make himself look good by making Samuel look bad, that was the most honest assessment of the entire situation. That's exactly what was happening. George saw an opportunity to create a viral moment, to get his name trending, to show everyone how tough he could be. And he thought he could do it at Samuel's expense because, what, Samuel would just sit there and take it? Because celebrities are supposed to smile and nod and accept whatever treatment they get? Wrong. Samuel L. Jackson built his career on being authentic, on bringing real presence to every role, on never backing down. And he wasn't about to start backing down for a morning show host with an attitude problem. He gave George every opportunity to course correct, every chance to turn the interview into something worthwhile, and George refused. So Samuel did what anyone with self-respect would do. He left. The microphone hitting the chair was such a perfect punctuation mark to the whole thing. It wasn't dramatic or theatrical. It was just final. It said, "I'm done. This conversation is over." And then walking away while George sputtered and tried to save face, that was the icing on the cake. Samuel didn't need to say anything else. He had made his point. George was the one left scrambling. George calling after him, saying he couldn't just leave in the middle of an interview. That was desperation. That was realizing he had pushed things too far, and now he was going to be the one left looking bad. He wanted Samuel to stay so he could try to fix it, try to spin it, try to make it seem like they were just having a spirited debate. But Samuel wasn't interested in giving him that out. Watch me. 2 words. That's all Samuel needed. 2 words that said everything. You think I can't leave? You think I have to stay here and let you disrespect me? Watch me. Watch me walk away from your show, from your cameras, from your attempts to make yourself feel important. Watch me choose my dignity over your ego. And the studio, just watching it happen, unable to do anything. That was the culmination of every bad decision George made during that interview. He had created a situation that spiraled completely out of his control, and now all anyone could do was watch it crash and burn. The other host trying to jump in and save things was almost sad. What were they supposed to say? How do you recover from watching your co-host drive away one of the biggest stars in Hollywood through sheer arrogance and rudeness? You can't. You just smile awkwardly and cut to commercial and hope people forget about it. But people weren't going to forget about this. Samuel in the green room, calm and collected, that tells you everything about who was in the right here. He wasn't ranting, he wasn't upset, he was just done. He had handled the situation, stood up for himself, and now he was ready to move on. Meanwhile, George was back on set having a meltdown, trying to justify himself to his producers, trying to convince everyone that he was just doing his job. But his producers knew better. They knew he had crossed a line. They knew this was going to be a headache for them. They knew George had let his ego write a check that the show was going to have to cash. And George trying to defend himself, insisting he was asking tough questions, that just showed he still didn't get it. He still thought he was in the right. That's the scary part. George genuinely believed he was doing good television. He thought being confrontational and rude was the same as being a good interviewer. He thought tearing someone down was the same as holding them accountable. And when it all fell apart, when Samuel walked off and George was left looking like a fool, he couldn't understand why everyone was mad at him. That's what happens when ego takes over. You lose perspective. You start thinking that whatever you do is justified because you're the one doing it. You stop seeing the people around you as actual human beings and start seeing them as props in your show, as tools to make yourself look better. And eventually, someone like Samuel L. Jackson comes along and reminds you that no, actually, people don't have to put up with that. People can say no. People can walk away. And when they do, you're the one left holding the bag. The internet reaction was swift and brutal. People weren't just criticizing George. They were tearing him apart. They were pulling up clips of other interviews where he had been rude or dismissive. They were questioning why he still had a job. They were calling for apologies, for consequences, for change. And through it all, Samuel L. Jackson stayed quiet. He didn't need to say anything else. The video spoke for itself. That's power. Real power. Not the fake power of sitting behind a desk and asking aggressive questions. Real power is knowing when to speak and when to let your actions do the talking. Real power is having the confidence to walk away from something that isn't serving you. Real power is making people respect you without having to demand it. George wanted power. He wanted to be seen as this fearless interviewer who could go toe-to-toe with anyone. But he confused power with cruelty. He confused being tough with being mean. And in the end, all he did was show everyone exactly who he was. A small man trying to seem big by standing on someone else's shoulders. Samuel didn't need to make George look small. George did that all by himself. All Samuel did was refuse to help him, refuse to play along, refuse to sit there and be a punching bag for someone's insecurities. And that refusal, that simple act of standing up and walking away, became one of the most memorable moments in morning television history. Not because it was planned, not because anyone wanted it to happen, but because it was real. It was authentic. It was a man choosing himself over the show, and people responded to that.